The boy from Brooklyn. Alphonse Gabriel Capone was born on January 17, 1899, in Brooklyn, New York. His parents, Italian immigrants, had come to America for a better life. Al grew up in a poor neighborhood with many siblings. His father was a barber, and his mother worked as a seamstress. Al did well in school for a while, but at age 14, after hitting a teacher, he was expelled and never returned. With no school, he spent more time on the streets, where gangs ruled. He joined the 5 Points gang, known for violence and crime. There, he learned how to fight, hustle, and handle dangerous people. It was during this time that Al got the scar that gave him the nickname Scarface. He insulted a woman in a bar, and her brother slashed his face with a knife. Al hated the nickname, but it stuck. One man in the gang, Johnny Torrio, saw potential in Al. Torrio was smart and ran criminal operations with a business mindset. When Torrio moved to Chicago, he later invited Al to join him there. Al accepted. He left behind the rough streets of Brooklyn for a new start. He didn't know it yet, but Chicago would turn him into one of the most powerful and feared men in America. Chicago's rising star. When Al arrived in Chicago, he worked closely with Johnny Torrio. At first, Al ran small jobs, collecting money, protecting bars, and delivering goods. But then came Prohibition in 1920, when the government banned alcohol. That changed everything. People still wanted to drink, and criminals saw a chance to get rich. Torrio began building a bootlegging empire, secretly making and selling alcohol. Al helped run the operation and proved himself to be smart, loyal, and ruthless when needed. By 1925, Torrio was nearly killed in a gang attack. Shaken, he decided to retire and handed full control to Al. At just 26 years old, Al Capone became the boss of the Chicago outfit. Al didn't hide in the shadows. He wore flashy clothes, drove expensive cars, and was seen in public. He claimed to be a businessman, but behind the scenes, he ruled through fear and violence. He bribed police, judges, and politicians to protect his empire. Al's gang earned millions every year from bootlegging, gambling, and protection schemes. If someone got in the way, Al made sure they didn't do it again. Still, many poor people admired him. He gave money to families, opened soup kitchens, and acted like a hero to the needy. But his fame and fortune made him many enemies, and not just other gangsters. The government had begun watching. Blood in the streets. Al Capone's rise to power came with a cost. Chicago was now a war zone. Rival gangs fought to control the city, and bodies often lined the streets. Capone believed in sending clear messages. If someone crossed him, they paid the price. The most famous example came on Valentine's Day, 1929. Al wanted to eliminate George Bugs Moran, leader of a rival gang. That morning, 7 of Moran's men were lined up in a garage and gunned down by men dressed as police officers. Moran escaped, but the message was clear. Capone was the king of Chicago. The public was shocked by the brutal murders. Newspapers spread the story across the country, and for the first time, people saw Capone not just as a gangster, but as a dangerous criminal. Still, it was hard to tie him to the crime. He always kept his hands clean and had loyal men do his dirty work. Witnesses were too scared to speak, and police were often paid to look away. But the Valentine's Day massacre made the federal government take notice. Capone had become too big, too bold, and too public. He had embarrassed the system. While he still ruled Chicago with an iron fist, agents in Washington were now focused on bringing him down, and they would come at him from a direction he never expected. Untouchable trouble. As Capone's empire grew, so did the pressure to stop him. Local police couldn't do much. Many were on his payroll. But the federal government sent a new team, led by Agent Elliot Ness. Ness and his men refused to take bribes. The press called them the Untouchables. Capone laughed at first. He had faced enemies before, but Ness slowly chipped away at his operations, shutting down breweries, destroying trucks, and arresting Capone's men. Still, nothing stuck to Capone himself. Then the government tried a new plan. Taxes. Even gangsters had to pay taxes, and Capone had never filed a return. He thought he was safe, but investigators began tracking his money and linking him to illegal profits. In 1931, Capone was finally arrested, not for murder or bootlegging, but for tax evasion. The trial was big news. Crowds gathered to see the famous gangster. Capone tried to bribe the jury, but the judge replaced them at the last minute. Capone was found guilty on multiple counts and sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. For the first time, the man who ruled Chicago was behind bars. His empire began to fall apart without him. Worse still, prison life would break his body and mind in ways bullets never could. Behind bars, Capone began his sentence in 1932 at the U.S. Penitentiary in Atlanta. He expected special treatment, but officials kept him under close watch. He had money, but it couldn't buy freedom here. Even worse, Capone's health was failing. Years earlier, he had contracted syphilis, a serious disease that had gone untreated. In prison, it began to affect his brain. He suffered from mood swings, confusion, and memory loss. Despite his condition, Capone tried to act like the boss. He dressed neatly, kept his head high, and sometimes bragged to guards about his past. But the truth was clear. Capone was no longer in control. In 1934, he was moved to Alcatraz, a high-security prison on an island near San Francisco. It was cold, isolated, and impossible to escape. Here, Capone was cut off from his gang and the outside world. He became just another prisoner. He followed strict rules, worked in the laundry, and lived in a tiny cell. The other inmates saw him not as a powerful leader, but as a sick man fading away. The once great Al Capone, who had owned the streets of Chicago, was now trapped by silence and sickness. But his story wasn't over yet. His final years would show just how far he had fallen, from king of crime to a man lost in his own mind. The empty throne. While Capone sat behind bars, his empire crumbled. New leaders rose in Chicago, but they didn't have his power or charm. The police cracked down harder, and the city slowly changed. Capone, meanwhile, was growing worse. Doctors at Alcatraz saw how quickly his mind was fading. He forgot names, dates, and sometimes didn't know where he was. In 1939, after serving about 7 years, he was released early for health reasons. He wasn't free, he was broken. He returned to Florida, where he owned a large house by the sea. But it was no palace anymore. He spent his days walking in circles, talking to himself, and playing the same songs on the radio. His wife and son cared for him, but there was little they could do. Sometimes Capone still believed he was the boss. He talked about meetings that didn't exist or gang wars that had ended long ago. Other times, he sat quietly, staring out at the ocean. Doctors said his brain had been damaged too badly to recover. The man who once ordered murders and ran millions in crime could no longer read a newspaper or hold a full conversation. People whispered stories about him, some true, some not. But Capone no longer noticed. He was a shadow of what he once had been, and the end was drawing near. A mind in pieces. By the early 1940s, Capone was no longer the fearsome man he had once been. He lived quietly in Florida, far from the streets of Chicago. His body was weak, and his mind was even weaker. He often stayed in his bedroom or wandered the gardens of his estate, lost in thoughts that didn't make sense. He spoke to people who weren't there. He gave orders to invisible gangsters. Sometimes he laughed at old jokes, not realizing they had already been told. Family and doctors tried to keep him calm. They gave him medicine, watched over him, and kept him away from stress. But the damage from the disease could not be undone. Al Capone was only in his 40s, but his mind was like that of an old man. Even the newspapers had moved on. The world was changing. World War II was happening. And few still cared about a gangster who had disappeared years ago. Capone was no longer a threat. He was no longer a leader, a fighter, or even truly aware of who he was. His days were quiet, filled with confusion and silence. But one thing was clear, his time was ending. The man once known as Scarface, feared by many and famous across the nation, had reached his final chapter, the final day. On January 21st, 1947, Al Capone collapsed from a stroke. Doctors rushed to help him, but his body was too weak. His health had been poor for years, and now it was failing fast. His family gathered at his home in Palm Island, Florida. For 2 days, Capone drifted in and out of consciousness. He couldn't speak much. He barely recognized the people around him. On January 25th, pneumonia set in. His lungs filled with fluid, and he struggled to breathe. His body had no strength left. That evening, at the age of 48, Al Capone died in his bed, surrounded by his wife, May, and a few close family members. There were no crowds outside, no reporters shouting questions, no roaring engines or gunshots in the night. The man who once ruled Chicago with fear and fire had passed away quietly. Capone's story had been full of risk, violence, and power. He rose fast and fell even faster. He had been a gangster, a millionaire, a prisoner, and finally, a forgotten man. His death marked the end of one of America's most notorious crime stories. No more orders to give, no more enemies to fight. Al Capone, the man they called Scarface, was gone.